Grain-fed goats. I guess it's a little too hot to graze right now, but there they are. Open up the milk store. So when we talk about grain-fed animals, obviously we're also talking about soy, which is a legume. So I guess when I say grain-fed in this video, I'm talking about seeds, feeding animals seeds. These trees here are mesquite trees. They're not in production right now, but once or twice a year, sometimes every other year, they produce these beans that I don't see any of right now, but I'll find some and show them to you. And the goats pick them up off the ground and eat them. Here's another one. I don't see any beans on it, but it will have them sooner or later. I don't know what this plant is, but it looks like it's maybe related to the Inca berry. And it makes these little papery balls that are full of these tiny seeds. Hundreds, look at this. Hundreds of these little seeds. They're about little smaller than quinoa, a little bigger than amaranth, like 3 to 4 times the size of an amaranth seed, right? And there are literally a couple hundred, maybe 300 or so inside of one of these puff balls. And look how many this plant makes. And our goats love to eat these when they're dry like that. They'll just walk around and pick them off and eat all the little delicious seeds in there. This one is some kind of a medicinal plant. And it makes these long, sticky seeds. Each one of these little pods, like this one here, not a pod, I guess, whatever that's called. I'm not a botanist. Each one of these flowers obviously turns into a little seed ball like that with, I don't know, maybe 50 or so little long little seeds. And the goats love to eat those too. We also planted these beans. I don't know if they're native or if it's some kind of hybrid, if it's wild, or it's probably some kind of hybridized bean. I'm not sure, but it seems to be native to Ecuador or Latin America. It's like a staple here. It's called sarandaja, and it'll just grow anywhere you throw seeds. It doesn't really need much help, doesn't need any fertilizer, needs nothing. And it just produces these bean pods that the goats love eating too. I don't know where these bean trees come from, but they seem to be native to here as well. They're everywhere. The locals call them leucaena. And they make these long beans with a bunch of seeds inside. The seeds get significantly bigger than this, that the goats like to eat as well. Then there are also these pigeon peas. They may be native to Asia, I'm not sure. But they're extremely prolific. Over here they're called poroto palo. They just make a ton of beans constantly, year round, that the animals love. In addition to the leaves, obviously, as is the case with all of these leguminous nitrogen fixers. Our goats will also eat a little bit of this. I don't know what it is. Someone called it a thimbleberry or something like that. It's one fruit, well, one of few I forgot to show you in our Fruitarian Paradise video. But, you know, the goats will eat these a little bit, and just as any berry, I think, they're literally full of seeds, right? No, she doesn't want any right now. How about you? Do you want some? I think the pigeon pea is their favorite. There you go. Enjoy. So this is one of the bigger mesquite trees on the property. And it makes these beans and drops them all over the ground. And out in the pasture, not over here because there's too much goat shit and they're already kind of old and maybe a little moldy. Yeah, there's some mold inside. But when they are freshly, when they fall and they're still pretty fresh, goats will pick them up off the ground, and they really like to eat these. Let's see if we could show you some of these beans. Yeah, these are the beans. They're about lentil sized. As you can tell, these are already rotting and getting eaten by bugs. So the goats, when they're in this state, the goats won't touch them generally. These algarrobo trees, or as they're called in the West, what do they call them? Spanish carob or something like that. They're very much in the mesquite family, I think, just as this tree, except they make this yellow bean that's, let me see if there's any on the ground. Oh, there's one on the ground. These aren't fully mature yet, but there's about half of one that are filled with not just beans, but this sweet honey-like meal, I guess, that's actually good for human consumption and quite delicious. And these flower year-round, as long as they get water and chicken shit. Apparently they don't stop producing. You see all the little flowers up there? Under optimal conditions, and when the tree is mature, which this one isn't yet, they're only about 3 years old, each one of these flowers will turn into a bunch of little beans. Well, they're not that little actually. See, there's one right here, still green. But like, they maybe rest for a month and then they go into flower again, and they basically make beans year round. This is from the last round of beans, some leftovers, and as you can tell, it already has flowers ready to make more. And it's a great starvation food. Lots of carbs. You hear the beans crunching? The ones that make it through the grinder, I guess, sprout out in the pasture. Then there are also a variety of grasses that produce seeds once a year naturally, but if you water them 2 to 3 times a year, if you water them in the dry season. This one has already dropped most of its seeds, but it's got a good amount of seed on there, and there may be quinoa-sized seeds. And sometimes when they're in seed like this, I'll see goats out in the pasture completely ignoring the leaves and just going for these seeds, loading up on them. Look at that. San Pedro. Look at these flowers. Look how big they are. Ah, I'm gonna fall. These gals are gonna be milked in just a bit on our little milk stand here. And to keep them satisfied and occupied, to buy their milk from them, basically, we're gonna bribe them with some oats. So all that to say, and sometimes they get a little bit of corn too. All that to say that this idea that grass-fed ruminant animals shouldn't eat any grain, that's just extremist ideology like the carnivore diet or the vegan diet or whatever. I understand there are some people out there who are so anti-grain feeding animals, and for good reasons, but they're a little bit too extreme for my tastes, my liking. You know, in a perfect world, I would prefer not to give them any bought grain and just feed them with, all the grain seeds that we produce here naturally to kind of mimic what they would do in nature. Now, granted, many places in the world you may not have such abundance, right? And it's a little bit artificial because a lot of these plants are from elsewhere. But I mean, as insofar as like the faike tree over here, and granted, goats aren't native to here, but they've been adapted to here, and also deer has been brought from Spain, I want to say, and has adapted very well to these parts. Because due in part to the fact that in the dry season, where there really isn't a lot of green stuff to eat, if much at all, these trees drop hundreds of pounds sometimes of these beans. And I know people who have goat operations where their goats in the dry season, 50, 60, 80% of their diet is this stuff. It's not all grain because the bean has a hull, I guess you would say, the little pod. So it's not all grain, not all legume, but still, it seems like at least a third of their diet is, for at least, half the year, is beans, right? Now, obviously, there's no glyphosate here, and no, it is very much a natural bean, so that's very much different than soy, right? It's not processed, it just is what it is. So, long story short, all things in moderation, and I think it would be wise for some of these, especially for some of these city slickers, to realize that animals do eat grain in nature. It's just the way that we do it, and the types of grain that we give them, and seeds in general, that makes them unhealthy. And more so than anything, it's the fact that while they're getting all this grain, they're not getting enough fiber to support healthy rumen function. That's really the problem. So, all things in moderation. And I think grain feeding, giving your animals some grain as natural as possible, is is a great way, and it's the only way, really, especially in many places in the world, where you could actually have a productive animal farm. It's, it's all fine and good for some of these rich farmers, land rich farmers who just have acres and acres and acres of land and they can afford to, and they have irrigation or it rains year round. Yeah, that's great if you could, you know, afford to just grass feed your animals. But what they don't tell you is that they they plant beans in those pastures for their animals. They got clovers. They got there's they supplement those animals with high protein nitrogen fixers too. Okay, so it's not as cut and dry as some people like to make it seem. This whole, again, I don't support grain feeding your animals exclusively, and us, we want to move away from buying grain, but it would be idiotic for us to not take advantage of all these natural sources of high protein fodder that's here naturally or can be brought in and planted where you could provide your animals who, there's a leucaena sprouting out, probably from one of the beans one of our animals ingested. There's some more of the ficus bean. Our animals are confined to, our land is pretty big, but it's only really 3.5 hectares that our animals have access to, less than that. So, if you own that mountain over there and you could just let them loose, that's great. But I mean, you see how much grass there is up there right now, right? And those little enclaves over there, like maybe that one there, where you see a little bit of green, that's these trees, right? And I guarantee you, whether it's cows or goats, if you let them loose, that's where they go. Because it's likely that there's some water there, shade, and fodder. And that's what they eat this time of year, before the rains come and the mountains turn green. That's almost exclusively what they eat. And they do just fine, right? So, all things in moderation. A lot of people don't have any experience with any of this type of stuff, and they just talk trash without really understanding what it is that's happening. So, ultimately we want to move away from bringing in any grain, but only because we're hoping to produce it here on the homestead for our animals to take advantage of and get fat on, basically. And that's that. Thanks for watching.